We've had some amazing World Series over the years. I don't even need to tell you which years these are. Baseball fans can tell just by looking at the clips, after all. But the big question, the one that we've always asked, is which World Series was the greatest of all? Which series had the most drama, the most tension? Which series had the best story? And the answer might surprise you. Most people will claim it's whatever World Series they have the most fond memories of. So take this article by Chris Jaffe, for example, in the 2010 Hardball Times Baseball Annual. Many people think it was the 1975 World Series, which, to be honest, really was a good one. Jaffe said it was the 1972 World Series, which, while close, kind of lacked those stellar cliffhanger moments. Now, it's kind of a good argument. I mean, there were 6 one-run games in the 1972 World Series. However, you might forget that only 2 of those games were actually settled in the 9th inning. In fact, most of the highlights from those games came from earlier innings. It lacked a lot of the late inning drama that a truly great World Series needs. Now, wouldn't it be interesting if there was a good way to measure all of this? Well, there is, and it's called the Championship Leverage Index. In fact, the first article about the Championship Leverage Index, or CLI, was published in this same Hardball Times Annual. It's a shame that the Hardball Times is no longer around. I mean, Fangraphs still hosts the articles technically, though the web pages wind up broken and unreadable on my browser. I wish that we still had a single publication, even a print publication, where I could read what all the great minds in sabermetrics and baseball history have to say. Anyway, for those of you who haven't paid much attention to sabermetrics for the last few decades, like me, let me tell you about what this leverage business is all about. It all starts with win probability or win expectancy. This is a stat that tells us the chance a team has to win at a specific point in the game. You know, baseball is the ideal sport for this because it is a turn-based sport. In fact, you know that already. That's why baseball sims are so easy to make and so easy to play. Sports with continuous action like basketball and hockey are much harder to simulate because you can't simply divide those sports up into sections like you can with baseball. You'll have a certain base runner situation, out situation, and score situation with a certain number of outs remaining at every single point in any baseball game. Win probability is simply calculating your chances of winning given that situation. Tom Tango originally described leverage index by talking about the Bartman incident. You remember the Bartman incident, right? Everybody blames the collapse on this foul ball. However, Tom Tango noted that a different play was more important. That would be that was the nail in the coffin. Add it all together, and the Cubs went from a 95% chance of winning the game to a 4% chance in a single inning. Well, apologize for causing additional trauma to Cubs fans. Just remember that 2016 actually did happen. Anyway, the point behind all of this isn't just to say that the media and ordinary fans fixate on the wrong thing, though that's actually true. No, this is to show you that not all plays are created equal. Derek Lee's double, for example, wouldn't have mattered that much if it came when he led off the top of the 4th inning of that game. Anyway, the leverage index measures how important a given situation was in any game. If you look at that inning on Baseball Reference, you'll see it right away. Derek Lee's double added 35% to the Marlins' chance of winning the game, more than any other event in that inning. And this is obvious when you think about it. There was 1 man out, the bases were loaded. The Marlins were losing 3-1. They only had 5 outs remaining. That double made the score 3-3 and created a situation with 1 out and runners on second and third, which usually results in quite a few runs. Now, when you think about it that way, you'll realize that it actually is possible to measure this stuff mathematically. And when we can measure the leverage of a certain event, we can start to do really cool things with it. For example, we can use the same logic to determine which games have the biggest impact on a pennant race. This is something called Championship Leverage Index. Some games are more important to a pennant race than others. In this case, the Pirates barely played an important game all season since they kept losing. Meanwhile, the most important games tend to be the ones that determine whether a team will move on to the playoffs or not. And naturally, World Series games will have the highest championship leverage since they are the games that determine the championship. Now, this is really important when we're talking about a leverage index because not all games are created equal. Game 4 of the 1989 World Series might have been really important to winning the championship, but if you look at the probability of the Giants somehow beating the Athletics in 4 straight, you will realize that the championship leverage probably wasn't that high. Meanwhile, the championship leverage of Game 7 of the 1968 World Series was certainly much higher. After all, both teams were only a single win away from the title. This way of thinking allows us to look at a lot of concepts a different way. For example, we see here that the championship leverage of postseason series changes depending on how many wins and losses each team has. We can look at interesting things like which plate appearances was the most critical of all time, or in other words, which one truly had the highest championship leverage of all time. We can use this to look at which World Series was the greatest of all time. Notice, by the way, that the name Dave Studeman keeps coming up in these articles. That's because this is his system. I'm stealing his work and his ideas to make this video, and I want to give him full credit. Now, I know that the stat geeks probably think that this stuff is too basic for them, but you know, as a lifelong baseball fan, I honestly find this stuff absolutely fascinating. It's a fascinating method because it's a method to deal with otherwise subjective rankings like this one from ESPN a few years back. Now, I should be fair to ESPN, I think they used at least some logic to come up with this article, but I really like the Studeman approach much better. Now, we don't just want to look at a bunch of numbers and call it good. I mean, if I were only going to throw numbers at you, I'd create a computer program or a spreadsheet or something. This is a video, and a video needs a good story, and thankfully we have one. You see, the tensest World Series of all time, the one with the biggest championship leverage index swings of all time, the one with the most wild moments, the one with the most tension and drama, that happens to be the 1924 World Series between the Washington Senators and the New York Giants, and I bet you didn't think of that one. First things first though, Washington DC had never had a championship baseball team before 1924. Washington DC was home to a loose collection of professional teams throughout the 19th century. Most of them played poorly, as you can see in this graph taken from an issue of the Washington Evening Star in 1924. The Washington Senators folded in 1899 as a result of the syndicate ownership scandal and the contraction that followed. The Senators, or the Nationals, or whatever you want to call them, came along in 1901 with the new American League. This was deliberate, by the way. Ban Johnson was no fool. He knew that he could waltz right into the territory of the National League and set up shop very quickly. But, of course, the Senators were awful. Now, just so you know, I'm going to call them the Senators for the rest of the video. Yeah, I know what Baseball Reference says, and I don't care. You see, I read the original newspapers, and the Washington baseball team was alternatively called Senators and Nationals by all the local newspapers for decades. This idea of an official nickname is a completely modern concept created by the modern corporate sports environment. It is not a historically valid concept. Between 1901 and 1911, the latest date the Senators were in first place was May 9, 1905. Now, in 1912, the Senators managed to get to second place after winning both games of a July 4th doubleheader. This was the best season the Senators had ever had, but they weren't even close enough to be in a pennant race. The closest they got was 5 games back on August 5th. In 1913, the Senators managed to get to second place on September 26th. They finished 6.5 games back by the end of the year. And that was as close as they ever got to first place. I'm saying that for a reason. There had never been a Washington team that had been in a pennant race. Never. Not once in 50 years. The latest date a Washington, D.C. team was in first place was June 8, 1914. The next latest date was May 31st, 1916. Let that sink in. This franchise, this city, had never been in first place after mid-June. That's the significance that we're talking about here. The Senators lost their first 3 games in 1923. They never were higher than 4th place. Now, 1924 looked a little bit better when they beat Philadelphia on opening day, April 15th. However, they were as low as 7th place on May 15th. The big push started on June 17th when they beat the White Sox in Chicago 12-6. That started a 10-game winning streak that finally ended on June 26th when they lost to Philadelphia at home. And that streak pulled them into first place. This was officially the latest date in any year that the Senators had been in first place, but of course it couldn't last. Everybody knew it couldn't last. They fell back to second place after losing a close one to Detroit at home on July 11th. They lost a 16-inning game to the Browns on July 19th, pushing them down to third. Their next big push started on August 17th when they beat the Tigers at home. They won 8 straight this time before losing the first game of the August 26th doubleheader to St. Louis, a streak that propelled them to first place again. And then came the big series, the big one against the mighty New York Yankees at Yankee Stadium. Remember that championship leverage index? Yeah, these games were really high on that index. On August 28th, Washington exploded for 8 runs in the top of the 8th to win 11-6. They overcame 2 Babe Ruth home runs in the process. On August 29th, Walter Johnson pitched magnificently to beat the Yankees 5-1. The Yankees came back on August 30th when Bob Musial's double beat Curly Ogden in the bottom of the 9th inning 2-1. But then, in the top of the 10th on August 31st, Sam Rice hit a key double with the bases loaded and the Senators beat the Yankees 4-2. But the season wasn't over yet. The Senators were tied for first place after losing to Detroit 2-0 on September 15th. Despite sweeping 3 in Cleveland, they were still tied for first on September 18th. They demolished St. Louis on September 19th, 15-9, but then they lost a crazy game on September 20th to the Browns 15-14. Well, it was that kind of pennant race. It was up and down to the bitter end. Washington's biggest win of the season was actually a 7-5 win on September 27th at Boston. That put them 2 full games up over the Yankees. Their 4-2 win against Boston on September 29th was treated as the pennant clincher in the papers, though the Yankees were already mathematically out of it. And as good sportsmen, they lost the final game of the season in Boston 13-1. This was one of the greatest pennant races of all time, even though it didn't go down to the final day. And the historical context, the part that all the indexes and all the math doesn't tell you much about, actually makes this even more remarkable. This was truly history in the making. Meanwhile, in the National League, the New York Giants and Brooklyn Dodgers were tied for first as late as at the end of games on September 12th. Okay, I know that they were called the Robins at the time because of Wilbert Robinson, their manager. They were also called the Trolley Dodgers or the Dodgers in the newspapers, so I'm calling them the Dodgers. Anyway, the Giants seemed determined to blow it, splitting a home doubleheader with the Reds on September 16th, for example. They also split with the Reds on September 18th. The Cubs exploded for 4 runs in the top of the 12th to beat the Giants on September 20th. That same day, Brooklyn lost to Pittsburgh 5-4 in 11 innings at Ebbets Field. The Giants only managed 5 hits the next day as the Cubs and Tony Kaufman shut them out. Brooklyn, meanwhile, beat the Phillies in 10 innings on a single by Eddie Brown with 2 men out. The Giants beat the Pirates on September 23rd at home behind Hugh McQuillan's pitching. The Dodgers lost a heartbreaker at home to the Cubs that afternoon when Gabby Hartnett hit a home run off Dazzy Vance in the top of the 10th. The Giants won again on September 24th. So did the Dodgers, this time almost blowing it when Burley Grimes started to fall apart in the top of the 9th. A Max Carey 9th inning home run put a scare in the Giants on September 25th, but they managed to hold on to win. And then on September 27th, the Giants made short work of the Phillies. The Dodgers lost to Boston 3-2, and the pennant went to the Giants. It was a close pennant race, absolutely. In fact, 1924 is one of those seasons that you really should replay. The teams are fascinating and the storylines are incredible. But what we often forget is that the Giants had won their 4th pennant in a row, which was an all-time record at the time. The New York Giants in 1924 were really a lot like the New York Yankees in, say, 2001. They were an absolutely dominant team that everybody knew was going to win. So when you look at the newspaper articles previewing the 1924 World Series, you'll see a bunch of articles about how the Senators didn't stand a chance. But those articles really only make sense if you know the whole backstory. Of course the Senators didn't stand a chance. The city had never been in this position before. It was a playground for politicians, after all. It wasn't a serious baseball town like New York City. At least that's what people thought at the time. Now, if you look at the offensive stats, you'll wonder how the Senators even won the pennant. Left fielder Goose Goslin was their star offensive player with a grand total of 12 home runs, but 129 runs batted in. And I can hear all of the sabermetricians freaking out since I mentioned the forbidden stat. Sam Rice had a good offensive year, hitting .344. First baseman Joe Judge hit .324. The captain was shortstop Roger Peckinpah, who had been traded to the Red Sox after a poor World Series in 1921 for the Yankees. Meanwhile, their pitching staff was sensational. Walter Johnson was 36, but went 23-7 with a 2.72 ERA, 158 strikeouts, and winning the Baseball Writers Association's MVP award. Tom Zachary went 15-9 with a 2.75 ERA, and Furpo Marbury went 11-12 with 15 saves, completing 31 games as a sort of early version of the closer. But the Giants looked even better. Right fielder Ross Youngs hit .356 and was an offensive powerhouse. First baseman George Kelly drove in 136, hit 21 home runs, and hit .324. And Frankie Frisch, who would later be famous with the Cardinals, was an outstanding second baseman, leading the league with 121 runs scored. Virgil Barnes led the pitching staff with a 16-10 record. Hugh McQuillan went 14-8 with a 2.69 ERA. The pitching staff was formidable. Well, I don't think that the 1924 New York Giants were legitimately one of the best teams of all time. However, I can tell you that the Giants completely crushed the Senators when I recently replayed this World Series in Stratomatic, and it wasn't even close. Now, the first game of the World Series was almost overshadowed by a major scandal in New York. Remember that crucial late-season series the Giants had against Philadelphia? Word had it that young utility player Jimmy O'Connell had approached Philly shortstop Heine Sand with an offer of $500 if he agreed to not play so hard. Sand reported the incident directly to his manager. The manager reported it to National League President John Heidler. Commissioner Landis got involved. O'Connell implicated coach Cozy Dolan, who he claimed told him to make the offer. The scandal could have implicated a number of star players. In the end, though, Landis suspended O'Connell and Dolan, both of whom eventually made the permanently ineligible list. Now, both Dolan and O'Connell were eventually reinstated, but not until May 13, 2025, when Commissioner Manfred reinstated a number of deceased players. So that's what the backdrop of this World Series was. Now, this was a scandal that could have really shaken the public's faith in the World Series again. And as some have noted, O'Connell and Dolan were probably the fall guys. Anyway, this series is already exciting and we haven't even gotten to the games yet. It's hard to exaggerate just how excited the Washington, D.C. area was for this World Series. And the excitement carried to the airwaves. This series was broadcast over WCAP with the famous Graham McNamee at the microphone. Well, don't feel bad that we don't have recordings of those broadcasts. I mean, if you listen to the really old recordings that we do have, the ones from 1934, you will realize that the quality of radio broadcasts in those days wasn't exactly that high. Anyway, the Giants took a 2-1 lead over Walter Johnson in the bottom of the 9th inning of Game 1. With one out, Ossie Bluge hit a single. Roger Peckinpah, the captain, then doubled, scoring Bluge all the way from first base. The game then went into extra innings with both Walter Johnson and Giants starter Ard Neff still in there. Washington had runners on first and second with only one out in the bottom of the 10th. Unfortunately, Goose Goslin popped out to short. Joe Judge then flew out to right field and the game went on. In the top of the 12th, Walter Johnson started to falter. A single, a walk, an error, and another walk loaded the bases. The Senators got Frankie Frisch to ground out for the first out. However, Ross Young scored one with a single, and then George Kelly hit a sacrifice fly to score a second run. Washington did have its chances in the bottom of the 12th. Bucky Harris drove in Mule Shirley with one out. Sam Rice then hit a single, sending Harris to third, but Rice was caught trying to stretch it into a double. Goose Goslin, the big star, then grounded to second to end the ballgame. And so the Giants took Game 1 in 12 innings 4-3. Game 1 had a pretty big swing of win probability after the Senators staged that 9th inning comeback. And that was a sign of things to come. A big first inning home run by Goose Goslin in Game 2 put the Senators ahead in the series for the first time. Player-manager Bucky Harris contributed a home run of his own in the 5th to make it a 3-0 lead. But the Giants came back. New York got one when Hack Wilson, yes, that Hack Wilson, grounded into a double play with runners on first and third that made it 3-1. And then in the top of the 9th with a runner on at first and one out, George Kelly hit a big single to right field. Frankie Frisch was that runner on first, and he overcame a reported leg injury to score on the single. Irish Musial ground out to short for the second out, but Hack Wilson then tied the score with another single. In the bottom of the 9th, Joe Judge walked to lead things off. Ossie Bluge bunted him to second, and then came Roger Peckinpah, who hit a double, driving in the winning run. The Senators had blown a big lead, but managed to come through in the end, tying the series at 1 each. And that's when the scene shifted back to New York. Now, I need to note something here. They did not take any days off between games for travel in the 1924 World Series. That didn't become a permanent thing in Major League Baseball until the late 1950s. This is after the Giants and Dodgers moved west, and this is also after baseball really needed to establish a predictable postseason schedule for television. In other words, these guys got on the train north right after Game 2 and played Game 3 at 2 p.m. the next afternoon. The biggest blow from the lack of rest was that Captain Roger Peckinpah's series was all but over. He had been injured hitting that game-winning double in Game 2. He was taken out of the lineup in the 3rd inning of Game 3, visibly limping. Anyway, New York powered its way to an early lead in Game 3. The Senators tried to call their way back, but they were always a run or two short. Washington had knocked Giants ace Hugh McQuillan out of the box in the 4th inning. However, Giants relief pitcher Rosie Ryan held back the Washington offense, and Ryan managed to hit a home run to deep right in the bottom of the 4th. Those of you who care a lot about guys with no home runs hitting one in your replay should pay attention. Ryan had never hit a major league home run before that moment. In the bottom of the ninth, Washington managed to load the bases with only one out, down by a 6-3 margin. Claude Jonard replaced Ryan and promptly walked Ossie Bluge, making it a 6-4 game. Mule Watson came on for the Giants to pitch. He got Ralph Miller to pop out to third base, and then Muddy Rule ground out to third base, ending the threat. Though Washington's rally didn't succeed, they certainly made it close. Washington had Game 4 in control from the start thanks to a 3-run home run by Goose Goslin. A single by third baseman Freddie Lindstrom drove in one in the bottom of the ninth, making it a 7-3 ball game, but the Giants came no closer than that. You see, the thing about baseball is that it really is pretty predictable. Washington came into the bottom of the ninth inning with a 98% chance to win. So even after Furpo Marbury gave up that run and a few base runners, the Senators still had a 90% chance of winning, and the odds were right. Goose Goslin homered in the top of the eighth in Game 5, making it a 3-2 Giants lead. However, Walter Johnson fell apart in the bottom of the eighth. A walk, a single, and an error spelled a big inning, and the Giants capitalized. By the time the bottom of the ninth came around, Washington was behind 6-2 and were facing Hugh McQuillan in relief. This time there was no rally. And that set us up for Game 6, which was filled with drama that doesn't come out in the box score. George Kelly singled home Ross Youngs in the first inning to give the Giants a 1-0 lead, and Art Neff had things in control on the mound. However, Roger Peckinpah decided to sacrifice his longevity. He started Game 6 despite his injury, and he singled to lead off the bottom of the fifth. He was bunted over to second. Pitcher Tom Zachary hit a ground ball to the right side, allowing him to reach third. Earl McNeely walked and stole second, and then manager Bucky Harris got the big hit, a single to drive in two, making it a 2-1 game. Peckinpah stayed in the ball game into the ninth inning and had to be helped off the field. But the Giants didn't get any closer, and the series was tied at 3 games each, sending it to a 7th game. This was the first 7th game since 1912 and only the 3rd in the history of the World Series. Now, Game 7 of the 1924 World Series was arguably the most intense World Series game of all time. We'd already seen a number of late comebacks and heroics. This one, though, really takes the cake, but we need to set it up first. John McGraw was known for platooning above all else. Giants first baseman Bill Terry hit almost exclusively against right-handed pitchers in 1924. If you look at his splits, you'll see why McGraw platooned him. Terry, however, was having a remarkable World Series, hitting well over 400 with a home run and a triple. Against left-handed pitchers, McGraw would have center field George Kelly play first base. He usually had Hack Wilson play center field since Wilson hit really well against lefties in 1924. And this was a big deal to McGraw. I mean, John McGraw was basically the classic Stratomatic advanced player before the game was ever created. Righty-lefty matchups were everything to him. The question in Washington, D.C. was whether Bucky Harris was going to start Curly Ogden on the mound or not. Ogden pitched only twice in September 1924 despite having a good season. He was rocked out of the box by the Red Sox on September 7th in the first inning, the victim of a sore arm. But then on September 24th in Chicago, Bucky Harris did something unusual. He used Ogden as a fake starter. Curly walked Maurice Archdeacon to open up the ball game and then was replaced by Tom Zachary, who went the rest of the way for Washington. The change forced the White Sox to make some interesting managerial moves using pinch hitters early in the ballgame. It was a bold strategic move that paid off, and sure, it would work against the last-place White Sox, but would you try a stunt like that in Game 7 of the World Series against the juggernaut New York Giants? Well, Ogden came out to start the game. Predictably, Bill Terry was at first base in the right-handed platoon lineup. Ogden struck out Freddie Lindstrom. He then walked Frankie Frisch. And on came left-handed pitcher George Morgridge in a move that must have infuriated John McGraw. Bucky Harris hit a home run to put Washington up 1-0 in the bottom of the 4th inning. In the top of the 6th, Mogridge started to falter. There were runners on first and third when Bill Terry was due up, and McGraw made his move. Irish Musial replaced Terry. Bucky Harris went with Furpo Marbury, the famous relief pitcher, turning the Giants' lineup backwards yet again. But Musial tied the score with a sacrifice fly. 2 infield errors in that inning allowed 2 more runs to score, and the Giants had a 3-1 lead. And time was running out. Bucky Harris managed a single with the bases loaded in the bottom of the 8th, tying the ball game. Legend has it that the ball struck a pebble and bounced over Freddie Lindstrom's head at third base, an unusual play. Star pitcher Art Neff came back on to pitch for the Giants to shut the door. In desperation, Harris called Walter Johnson out of the bullpen to pitch the top of the ninth. The Washington fans went crazy with delight at the sight of their ace, the greatest pitcher in the city's history. Johnson had lost 2 games so far in the World Series, blowing the chance he had waited so many years for. He almost blew it in the top of the ninth when Frankie Frisch hit a triple with 1 man out. Johnson was able to get George Kelly to strike out and Irish Musial to ground out, barely getting by. In the bottom of the ninth, Joe Judge hit a line drive single to first base with 1 man out. Ossie Bluge hit a ground ball to second that should have been an inning-ending double play. Second baseman Kelly made the play and flipped it to shortstop Travis Jackson, who proceeded to drop it. Judge made it all the way to third on the air. McGraw brought on Hugh McQuillan, who got Ralph Miller to ground to Travis Jackson. This time Jackson made the play correctly, a double play that ended the threat. And we were headed for extra innings once again. The last game looked just like the first. In the top of the 11th, the Giants had Lindstrom on at second base with only 1 out. Johnson struck out Frankie Frisch swinging. He then got George Kelly to strike out swinging in a masterful display of pitching. New York, meanwhile, had been mowing through its pitching staff in hopes of holding the Senators back. Jack Bentley gave up a double to Goose Goslin with 2 men out in the bottom of the 11th. McGraw decided to walk Joe Judge and test Ossie Bluge instead. Bluge ground out to short, ending that threat. Johnson, pitching on fumes, managed to retire the side quietly in the top of the 12th. And then came the famous bottom of the 12th inning, the half inning that is the stuff of legend. Well, with 1 man out, Muddy Rule hit a pop fly behind the plate. Giants catcher Hank Gowdy had a hard time finding the ball, stumbling over his mask and dropping it at the last second. Rule had another chance and promptly ripped a pitch past Lindstrom at third base for a double. And up came Walter Johnson. Johnson had pitched 4 innings in relief and was dead tired. This was basically his legacy, his whole career. He was 36 years old. The Big Train would pitch for 3 more seasons, well, 2.5. He only pitched 100 innings in 1927. This, though, was his moment in the sun. And thankfully, Bucky Harris decided to leave his man in instead of using a pinch hitter, even though it was probably the wrong decision. Now, you naturally would think that Johnson would try to bunt. Instead, he hit a ground ball to short that was kicked by Travis Jackson. Rule had to stay at second, which is pretty good evidence that it was not a bunt by Johnson. And that put runners on at first and second with 1 man out. Up came Earl McNeely, and the crowd was going wild. McNeely hit a ground ball to third base that got through Lindstrom. Legend has it that the ball hit another pebble and bounced over Lindstrom's head. The winning run scored as the crowd exploded with delight. Newspapers reported that the celebration was bigger than the celebration to mark the end of the World War. Through a ghostwriter, John McGraw called it the greatest World Series of all time. The stats told the story. The Giants out-hit Washington by a large margin but wound up on the losing end. Walter Johnson's mother was contacted by reporters after the game who wrote about the tears streaming down her face. Newspapers reported that other fans were overcome with emotion at the news. It was a crazy sight. Washington, forever the doormats of the American League, was now on top of the world. This win probability chart for Game 7 really says it all. The Giants had about an 87% chance of winning the World Series with 1 out in the bottom of the 8th. The momentum swings after that point were simply wild. According to the Leverage Index, there has never been a baseball game with as much tension and as many swings as this one when you consider the importance of the game in the championship picture. That's a controversial statement, I know. There have been games with bigger swings, sure, but this one was Game 7 of the World Series, and this wasn't a scoreless game that ended in the 10th either. There were comebacks by both teams and then that crazy ending. Now, we don't remember the 1924 World Series the same way we do most modern series. Blame that on television. But there never was a World Series that had this kind of drama or intensity. Washington winning was a total shock, even more so than the Red Sox winning in 2004. It was sort of like the Cubs winning in 2016, except of course that the Cubs had chances to win numerous times before that series. Washington, remember, had never had a chance to win anything. They had never even been in a pennant race. Anyway, I would love to know what you think about all this. In my mind, and for my money, this was the greatest World Series of all time, and it's a great season to replay as well. Give it a chance if you haven't.